Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our Foster Care Conference. If you'll please help me, I'd like to invite CPOC Juvenile Services Committee Vice Chair and Chief of Shasta County Probation Department, Chief Tracy Neal, to the stage. Let's welcome her.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Neal, and I am the Chief Probation Officer of Shasta County Probation Department. Welcome to Day 2 of the 2022 Foster Care Conference, Building Connection for a Better Future. We hope you enjoyed Day 1, found the sessions very informative, and have expanded your professional connections. Seeing the documentary yesterday and hearing from the Gaines family was impactful and challenges us all to continue our work to improve services for youth and continue efforts to find and support foster and resource families. I was personally inspired by Kiki Ferris yesterday in her breakout session on racial equality. She's right there. How many of you attended that session? It was pretty amazing, huh? I appreciated her humor as she talked about equity in an honest way. She talked about Contra Costa's placement journey over the last 5 years, with her focus being on train, revise, and rethink. I appreciated her passion for working with youth and for advocating for a new system to improve outcomes. Plus, she included a great exercise that engaged the audience and got us all moving. I was wondering if you've ever been to Shasta County. Well, I will definitely be having my supervisor of our juvenile division, who is sitting over there, Mr. James Goodwine, reach out to you because I really enjoyed what you've done at Contra Costa. I think we can all agree that the food and the snacks yesterday were amazing. So definitely give it up for CPOC for organizing the food, and I'm sure we're in for some great food and snacks today as well. We have 2 amazing keynote speakers presenting today. First, Professor Jessica K. Heldman, who will be discussing California's probation evolution over the past 25 years, and she's sitting up front this morning. During her keynote presentation, Progress in Partnership, Reflections on the Past 25 Years and the Road Ahead, she will share findings from the recent California Probation Resource Institute commissioned report, The Evolution of the Juvenile Justice and Probation Practices in California, which examines 25 years of juvenile justice as administered by California County Probation Departments. She will also share how probation departments and partners can confront ongoing challenges facing foster youth and their families. Following the break, our next keynote speaker will be Anthony Poponi, who has a long history of working with youth and helping individuals understand their personal responses to life's challenges and using that information to not let oneself stay in a negative space for long periods of time. As a 2-time resource foster parent, he deeply appreciates those working in youth services and realizes not every moment in this work is easy. During this revitalizing session, Anthony will share the research on the areas where to best focus our energy to provide lasting happiness and ongoing success in our work and in our personal lives. He will also discuss how to quickly tap into both the hard and fun parts of our days for a happy, successful, and fulfilling life. In addition to these 2 keynote speakers, you will also have an opportunity to benefit from several sessions this afternoon, including a discussion on aftercare and the FFPSA Part 4 requirements, and learn what a few counties have developed. A presentation on working with LGBTQ+ youth in the juvenile justice system, and building off our inspirational documentary yesterday, we will also have a session on effective family finding and strategies to support resource families. And if you really want to attend all three, don't do what I did yesterday and try and sneak in all the sessions and get a little bit of each session. Don't do that, not unless you really like to go between the sessions. CPOC is recording all the sessions, and they will be available on the on-demand platform in the near future. I want to quickly thank CPOC and the CPOC staff for putting on such a great conference and bringing us together to talk about the important work with our youth and our families. It's provided a great opportunity for us to learn from each other and be able to expand on what other counties are doing. Thank you again for being in attendance today. We hope you find the sessions rewarding and beneficial to your work, and thank you again for attending.
I like having walk-on music like that. That's pretty cool. My brother works for the San Diego Padres, and he runs the Jumbotron. And so he works with the players to pick their own walk-on music. So I was just sitting down there thinking to myself, what would I pick if I could choose my walk-on music? But that was pretty good. That was pretty good. Good morning, everyone. And yesterday, somebody spoke in the morning and said, I'm not the kind of person who's going to make you all respond to me and say good morning back. I am that kind of person. So I'm going to say good morning to all of you. And good. That's my way of making sure you're all at least a little bit awake as the coffee starts moving through your veins this morning. I think it's especially important that we get that coffee flowing because I'm going to be talking a lot about research. Yesterday you got to watch a movie in the morning. A little later you're going to hear about happiness. I'm talking about research, okay? So I want you to be awake. I want you to have that coffee going. So I just want to start by thanking CPOC for having me here, giving me the opportunity to talk to a room full of probation professionals and system partners. For me, this is kind of a culmination of the work that I've done throughout my career on cross-system initiatives within child welfare and juvenile justice. So I really appreciate the opportunity to reflect on my own journey as well as present the research that I've done, which is a reflection on 25 years of probation. But before I get into the research, I'd actually like to share a little bit with you about the part of my career that came before I was a professor, before I was an attorney, before I was a consultant. I was actually a drama teacher, a theater educator. And I love looking, when I say that, I love looking at the crowd because there's always a few people who've had, an encounter with a theater person, and they always sit there wondering, what's she gonna make us do, right? Are we gonna be doing trust falls? Are we gonna have to do, yeah, I see the nodding, you've been there. I promise you're not gonna have to do anything, except I would like you to imagine. I want you to imagine 25 years ago, which is when this picture is from, when I was teaching in a classroom at an emergency foster care shelter. I had the opportunity to work specifically with kids in foster care and in the youth justice system. And granted, I put these little blue smiley faces on here to protect their identities, but I have to say this isn't radically different from the vibe that I had when I would come in and do drama activities with the kiddos there. So I would teach kids in emergency shelters, residential treatment centers, group homes, and 25 years ago, there were a lot more kids in these facilities, right? And I would come in and I would ask them to step out of their comfort zone, to take a risk, and to try something new, right? Kids in these circumstances at really challenging times of their life. Primarily what I would do was ask them to do two things. The first was to take on a role, and they could choose the role. We had lots of scenes, lots of skits that we would do, and I would ask them to just step into somebody else's shoes for a little while. And what I loved was that kids were really willing to step out of their public personas. They were really willing to try on something new. So I had kids who were really tough, and they were defiant. And those would be kids who would take on the role of a nurturer or a protector, maybe a caring parent, And then I had kids who were really withdrawn and reserved. And sometimes those kids would be the ones who would step into the role of a powerful Shakespearean king or queen. And I just loved seeing them take those risks and finding different parts of themselves, right? The other thing I would ask them to do is collaborate. And I want you to imagine that. I want you to imagine kids who were forced to be living in these facilities with one another, their peers, who were struggling with a lot of the same challenges and circumstances that they were. There were conflicts that were rising in these facilities, and they would come in and I would ask them to work together as a team towards a goal. A scene, a skit, something that they could do that would bring out the best in everyone and include everyone. Okay? So I was asking them to do that. And for the most part, they would. It wasn't all puppies and rainbows, but they were definitely willing to work together, and they learned what they could achieve. So speaking of lessons, the point of doing drama with kids in these situations was not to mold young actors. Rather, it was to teach them some important lessons. So what did they learn? First, they learned that there's growth that comes from taking risks and stepping outside your comfort zone. Second, they learned that we're all multifaceted individuals. We all have different roles that we can play in our lives. And the best way to understand someone else's perspective is to step in their shoes for a little while. And the third lesson that I hope that they would learn was that you can achieve great things by working together. And in fact, sometimes you just have to. Sometimes you just have to collaborate and work together to achieve what you set out to do. So these were the important lessons of childhood. Now fast forward a few years and I started working with grown-ups. And I found that a lot of these lessons of childhood were things that grown-ups needed to be reminded of. In fact, they were sometimes things that grown-ups really needed to just relearn, especially when they were in new circumstances and having new challenges, how to apply those same lessons to their work life and their professional endeavors. So one of the ways that I would build a foundation for collaboration in my classroom that then I took into my work with adults, I worked as a consultant doing cross-system integration and coordination initiatives. I would bring in this framework that I use to work with kids, and it's called yes and. Is anyone familiar with the yes and approach or framing or activity? Yeah, I see. Okay, good. Oh, there's one table. There's a table of yes and people over there. That's exciting. Okay, good. Hopefully they're not the same people that got scared when I said I was a theater educator. I don't know. Maybe you've had a good experience. But what we do with yes and in the theater classroom is it's an improvisation activity. And basically, the students work together to create a scene that has no set lines, really no set direction at all. They just dialogue with one another. And the only rule is that they have to start their response to their scene partner with the phrase yes and. So I might say, I'm going to the grocery store. And the scene partner says, yes. And while you're there, could you take my package to the post office? And I have to say yes. And I'd be happy to pick up some milk at the grocery store. A really riveting scene, right? But you get the idea. This gives us a language for collaboration. So often, we naturally have this instinct to try to steer things in the direction that we want them to go, or that we expect them to go, or reflects our perspective and our experience, right? But when we're collaborating and building something together, we need to take on an approach that welcomes other people's perspectives and realities, allows us to set a shared reality, and then allows us to build and progress on that reality together. It seems really simple, but it's something that was challenging for the kids and continues to be challenging as we work as adults. Now, how is this relevant to our work in youth justice? Well, I offer that this approach of yes and allows us to share a reality about where we are, and in the case of what I'm going to talk about today, the progress that we've made, while also steering us to look ahead and set a path forward. For example, we can say, yes, we have increased the number of kids who are diverted from our system. And we can expand opportunities for youth to remain in their communities and access the supports and services to meet their needs. Yes, we've reduced the number of kids who have been detained, and we can work to address the disproportionality that is still associated with detention. Yes, we have expanded our training, and we can be intentional about updating our practice in line with what we are learning. Yes, we have adopted evidence-based practices, and we can work to ensure that they are implemented fully by all staff and with fidelity. Yes, we have engaged in collaborative practices, and we can look for opportunities to strengthen our relationships with system partners, families, and communities. See how that works? Make sense? This is the language of collaboration and the language of progress. So if the kids we work with are willing to jump into that space and support one another and collaborate to reach their goals, shouldn't we be willing to do the same? Okay, so I'm going to turn now to some of the research that I've done, and I'm framing it as the yes. This is starting with the yes, right? What is it that we're going to acknowledge and accept and understand as our shared reality? We're going to start with an acknowledgement that there is a history that demonstrates progress in the work of youth justice and juvenile probation practice. My work on the recent report, The Evolution of Juvenile Justice and Probation Practices in California, which was commissioned by the California Probation Resource Institute, details this progress. Our goal for the report was to outline how juvenile justice in California has changed over the past 25 years. So I want to know who's in the room for a moment here. Can you raise your hand if you have been working in juvenile probation for, or with a partner system or agency for less than 5 years? Raise your hand. Less than 5 years? Okay. How about between 5 and 10 years? Okay. Between 10 and 15 years? Okay, and more than 15 years? Oh, wow. Okay, great. So we have a lot of long-standing professionals in this room here. So you've seen a lot of this change over 20, 15 years, right? So what we did to better understand this change is we took a look at a great deal of information. We reviewed reports from government agencies. We reviewed reports from advocacy, nonprofit research organizations. We took a look at media stories. We looked at 25 years worth of data and 25 years worth of stories. We conducted interviews with a wide array of folks, from retired chiefs to current chiefs, judges, attorneys, service providers, former probationers. We talked to legislative staff and executive branch staff. And we also sent out a survey that allowed us to gather information from probation staff, managers and supervisors that had been working in probation for a longer period of time to get their perspectives on how things had shifted. And from the hands that are raised, I think maybe some of you actually responded to that survey. So I thank you for that. And then what we did was we performed qualitative manual coding. Now that phrase is a cue for you to take another sip of coffee, right? That just means that everything we looked at, we looked for themes. We looked for themes among all of that information. And this exploration first allowed us to identify some of the key drivers of policy and practice change. We first identified the programs that were listed on this slide as key policy and funding measures that influence probation practice throughout this period. This is probably familiar to everyone here. Now, importantly, the major components of these programs were a focus on multidisciplinary approaches, community participation and partnership, and an investment in research-based practice. These drivers created a foundation for changes in practice. This is the foundation. I think a great capture of the kind of progress that was made on the basis of this foundation was articulated by Chief Cater, who was interviewed for this report. And he said, although probation's responsibilities are largely the same as they have been for quite some time, the approach to executing these responsibilities has significantly changed. Specifically, our comprehensive review identified evidence of increased commitment to the following. Oh, there's one other quote that I wanted to share. This is a quote from an advocate, Maria Remu from the Youth Law Center. She identified that we've seen a real pendulum shift from the 1990s and the tough on crime era and this drive to utilize adult-like and punitive interventions to now focusing on a system that recognizes that kids are different and what we understand through research, science, and applying that into juvenile justice practice. So from all of this information and these perspectives, we were able to identify these key aspects of change. First, we found evidence of an increased commitment to promoting prevention and alternative responses to formal prosecution and justice system involvement. We found increased commitment to utilizing validated risk and need assessments to guide decision-making and case planning. We found a commitment to developing and promoting alternatives to detention. We found evidence of communities beginning to redesign facilities to be more therapeutic environments. And we found a commitment to shifting toward a supervision approach that balances oversight and the promotion of behavior change using evidence-based practice. So breaking these down a bit. So let's start with the promotion of prevention and alternative responses. We have fewer kids in our system than we've ever had before. And we found this commitment to taking kids on this detour away from the system, as evidenced by our survey respondents, who strongly indicated a shift in the culture of probation departments towards reducing the number of youth formally processed. The comments of probation chiefs and managers surveyed for this report support the premise that a philosophical shift has largely occurred. Many specifically characterize the change in probation over the last 2 decades as increased prioritization of keeping youth out of the delinquency system who are high need but low risk. This really reflects the research-based understanding that was not at the forefront 25 years ago. Chiefs in particular highlighted that there's an increased commitment to implementation of evidence-based practices with regard to intake that has resulted in fewer youth being formally processed through the juvenile court. Now, state funding through competitive grants supported the development of prevention and early intervention efforts in a number of counties, which promoted increased collaborative, multidisciplinary service planning and community and family-based interventions. Ultimately, using a definition of diversion that includes closing cases at intake and engaging youth in informal probation programs, CPOC reported that in 2018, 67% of the referrals made to probation departments were diverted. We also identified evidence of a near universal adoption of validated risk and need assessments to guide decision-making and case planning. Our survey results suggest that these tools are in fact utilized in practice, not just adopted, but actually utilized in practice in order to help develop individualized interventions and case plans. And as you can see from the survey results, almost all those that we surveyed identified that probation officers routinely rely on the results of these validated tools to inform their case planning and case management. That's a massive shift from where we were 25 years ago. We also found evidence that probation departments have developed and promoted alternatives to detention. Clearly, the number of detained youth has decreased significantly over the last 25 years. It's a dramatic illustration. Now, of course, the number of youth arrested has decreased during this time as well. But at the same time, we found this decrease in detention occurred as probation departments took advantage of state funding to develop a variety of alternatives to detention. And in our report, we have examples of communities that have done just that. The survey of probation chiefs and managers revealed that 82% of counties routinely screen for detention eligibility. And this is an important step in curbing the inappropriate use of detention. Several survey respondents noted that the overall philosophy within their juvenile probation department has shifted from detention-oriented to rehabilitative, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, and that a commitment to alternatives to detention is now fully entrenched. We found evidence of some counties either transforming facilities into more rehabilitative-like environments or closing down or repurposing facilities in light of the reduced number of youth being detained. This is still an ongoing process, but we're seeing adjustments. We're seeing a change in philosophy and priority. We've also seen a willingness to collaborate with communities and advocates on dismantling practices in facilities that are harmful to youth. This approach, this change was well articulated by Sue Burrell, who stated that one of the accomplishments during this period was a willingness of folks, including probation, to work together to resolve some long-standing issues. Finally, we found evidence of a shift within probation departments toward a supervision approach that balances oversight and the promotion of behavior change using evidence-based practice. Our survey respondents overwhelmingly indicated that facilitating positive behavioral change is a key goal of the probation officer, and that this is done through matching youth needs with appropriate services and utilizing a system of graduated responses. This is quite different from in 1996, when the role of juvenile probation was described by the state as focused solely on surveillance and control. And to this end, almost all counties in our survey reported implementing some evidence-based practices within their departments. Now, some of the limited program evaluation data available provides modest evidence of positive youth outcomes. And the fact that as more youth within the juvenile justice system have been served closer to home and detained and formally processed less frequently, juvenile crime, as measured by juvenile arrests, has not increased. So this suggests that the combination of policy, funding, and practice change supporting a more rehabilitative and local approach to juvenile justice has not had an adverse effect on public safety. Rather, there's reason to believe that this approach has enhanced public safety. So what we conclude is that although we cannot demonstrate cause and effect because of the multiple factors associated with the reduction in arrests and incarceration, there is a clear correlation between the policy and practice developments over the past 25 years, a correlation between that and the decrease in juvenile offending and incarceration. So, in summary, there's evidence that state priorities and local practices have evolved in line with research-based practice. Arrest and detention rates have continued to decrease. There's modest evidence of positive outcomes from state-funded programming that emphasize multidisciplinary and evidence-based approaches. And that realignment, reduced arrests and detentions, and increased diversion has had no adverse effect on public safety. So this is the yes that we can promote and build upon in our own departments, in our own communities, and in partnership with others. So since we have a yes, you know by now, we're going to have an and. So this report also explores how to continue to expand on the positive impact that probation can have. So we made suggestions for future consideration that include the following. First, we recognize that investment on the local level is critical to supporting the advancement of best practice. State funding, of course, drives much of the policy and practice, but local investment is absolutely key. In particular, numerous survey respondents indicated that resources and services in their communities continue to be limited, and that this limits the positive effect that the youth justice system can have on children. So we implore local departments, governments, and communities to look for opportunities to address these service gaps and to ensure youth, family, and community needs are being met. It must also be recognized that systemic culture change is an ongoing endeavor, one that is essential to continuing improvement in juvenile justice practice. What does this mean, systemic culture change? Well, this means that there must be a continued effort to promote the value of research-based and rehabilitative practices rather than outdated punitive responses to youth. Some departments, some communities still struggle with that being a true culture change. This requires a continued and deepening commitment to comprehensive training on topics such as adolescent brain development, the impact of trauma, and research-based practice. This needs to happen in all parts of the state. It must also be recognized that enhanced data and evaluation is vital to continuing system improvements. We suggest that the long-standing critique regarding the dearth of meaningful outcome data to inform juvenile justice policy and practice needs to be addressed. Some of this may happen through new state legislation that requires the development of a modernized database statewide, but ultimately, local jurisdictions must set their own goals and track their own data to identify successes and challenges. It's hard to tell the story of success and challenges without that data. Trust me, we looked at 25 years worth and tried to find those opportunities to really highlight what worked and what hasn't. And sadly, it's really hard to find that data, so that needs to be an area of improvement. And finally, racial and ethnic disparities must be addressed throughout the juvenile justice and partner systems. Despite a continued decrease In arrests and detention, racial disparities persist. Local probation departments, in conjunction with schools, law enforcement, state and local agencies, and juvenile courts, must make a greater commitment to incorporating a racial disparity lens in practice in order to address this ongoing issue. So, how do we do all this? How do we achieve greater local investment, systemic culture change, enhanced data and evaluation, and elimination of racial and ethnic disparities? Well, I'm going to shift to giving you a little bit of perspective on what has worked in the work that I've done across the country in jurisdictions working together to address some of these persistent issues. Before I do that, I just want to pause for a moment, and if there's any questions with regard to the report and the research that I was just discussing, please feel free to write it down on any cards, and I know there's staff who will collect, and we may have time for some questions at the end. Okay, so how do we do this? I propose that an essential area in which to focus is partnership and collaboration. Again, my work as a consultant in initiatives around dual status youth, probation system review, and CPOC, as well as my research on disproportionality and disparities in child welfare and juvenile justice, points to collaboration as a vital part of achieving the best outcomes. And why is that? Well, if we're not on the same page with our responses and our interventions, we have a real risk of creating gaps or duplicating efforts. We will be inefficient with our time and our resources, and we know that those are things that are often in short supply. We also know that the kids that we work with have a variety of needs. They have experienced numerous traumas. Their circumstances are complex. So responding to that complexity must be multifaceted in and of itself. We know that we're more likely to reach the desired outcomes for youth if we are leveraging varied expertise and a wider array of resources. And finally, working together and sharing responsibility improves and encourages accountability. Data collection and evaluation is not as meaningful if it doesn't include information from others who are working with the same kids and families. Ultimately, no one can do this work alone. To return to the theater metaphor, this is not a one-person show. This requires a huge, big ensemble cast, right? Okay, I say all that recognizing that none of that is actually new to you. You all collaborate already, right? Some of it is informal, some of it is specifically required, and some has been incorporated into policy and practice. So a key example of this are your CFTs, right? I think almost everybody in this room either has knowledge about the policy of CFTs or participates in them on a regular basis. They require you to work collaboratively, to bring together the various professionals with information, expertise, and responsibility for assisting youth and families. They require everyone involved to take a strength-based and family-centered approach, right? That's at the root of your CFTs. And there's a growing collection of research supporting this collaborative approach to service delivery among youth and family-serving systems. However, results from our survey that we did for the report identifies that there's significant room for improvement in some relationships. What we heard through the survey: we are at constant war with social services. Families are seen as obstructionists. There is a lack of connection between our department and our communities. We suffer from preconceived notions of what law enforcement does. we have a poor relationship with behavioral health. And there's collaboration at the leadership level, but it breaks down at the line level. These are common refrains when working across systems and working with families and communities. And overcoming this requires a clear focus on youth and families. And I've worked on establishing cross-system partnerships throughout my professional career. And what I've found is that we are often focused internally on our system mandates, our system's assets and resources and needs. But that focus inward can limit our reach and our imagination and can generate conflict, especially when resources are scarce and mandates seem to be conflicting. Therefore, we have to focus on the one thing that no matter what, we all have in common, and that's the youth. It seems simple, but we can easily lose sight of the fact that we all share this common focus. So I ask you to consider that because these children that you serve and their needs are multifaceted, they are our collective responsibility, not the responsibility or problem of a single siloed agency or entity. We have to really give up this fallacy that there is a perfect fit for these complex child and family circumstances within any one system in isolation, or that it's systems alone that have the answers or resources needed. Rather, we have to center our processes around the youth and families and recognize the value and resources that each of our systems, families, and communities can bring to the table. This requires promoting a culture of collaboration within and among our systems. So the foundation for this includes asking the following questions. Can we come to a shared understanding about who we are serving? What research tells us about their challenges, their strengths, and their assets? Can we establish a shared vision of what success for youth, families, and communities looks like? And can we agree that this vision must be informed by those that we serve? Can we come to agreement on goals that we have for our systems and communities working together? Can we agree on what outcomes we are seeking and that we are jointly responsible for? And finally, can we share the responsibility for achieving those outcomes and hold one another accountable? A culture of collaboration is foundational to resolving the persistent issues and challenges we face in youth justice and with children in foster care, even after 25 years of progress. So the work of collaboration can benefit from the adoption of a framework that involves several key components. First, establishing a cross-system infrastructure. And we really mean infrastructure, not just some meetings, but an actual infrastructure which allows folks to take the time to review policy and practice together and work out some of the kinks. It also requires engaging in cross-system training and education to better understand the youth and families that you're trying to serve. Can you raise your hand if you have taken part in an actual training, cross-system training in your community between probation, child welfare, behavioral health, education? Raise your hand if you've done that. Okay, so we're making a lot of progress on that, about half the room. Great. We also need to institutionalize the coordinated and collaborative processes and practices that we establish. I was talking to some folks yesterday, and we talked about the fact that so often the way that we work together is kind of informal, and it's based on, I know somebody over there that I can call and talk to, and we can work it out, we can figure it out together. That's informal, and what happens when those professionals are no longer in their positions? We lose that relationship, we lose that connection. So it's really about institutionalizing this. And then finally, we need to establish the ability to evaluate system and youth outcomes. Have I said that already? That's definitely something that I think is quite important. Helps us identify what's working and what's not. So I've applied this exact framework to several areas of ongoing challenges in the youth justice field. These include effectively serving dual status youth, addressing really the tragic problem of commercial sexual exploitation of children, and the long-standing problem of disproportionality and disparities for families and youth of color in our systems. So I'm going to give you just a quick journey through those different areas of persistent challenge and how we've applied that framework for collaboration. Now, in dual status youth work, we're seeking to improve outcomes for youth who touch both our child welfare and our juvenile justice systems. You might have seen this red and white book. This is a guidebook for system integration focused on dual status youth. And of course, these are the youth that many of you are working with, right? Here at this, who you are coming to this conference on foster care. You're working with kids who are touching both systems, right? Unfortunately, these youth tend to experience some of the poorest outcomes among all youth that we work with, and they tend to really challenge our systems. So effectively serving these youth requires establishing that cross-system infrastructure, bringing together everyone who plays a part in supporting these families, child welfare, juvenile justice, education, service providers, judges, attorneys, all to engage in that long-term exploration of policy and practice. Again, this is not a one-time thing. This is really creating a cross-system culture. And it must include community, parents, and youth stakeholders. Now, when working with dual status youth and creating policy and practice, we need to establish a shared understanding of who these youth are and what works best in serving them. For example, is everyone here aware of the incredibly high rates of trauma among justice-involved youth? You probably are. Are you aware of the high percentage of juvenile justice-involved youth that have had contact with child welfare services? You may be. The research that we've done in numerous jurisdictions tells us pretty consistently it's about 2/3 to 3/4 of kids in our juvenile justice system who have had some contact with child welfare services. And are you aware that studies have shown that kids who touch both of our systems, both of those systems, have consistently had the poorest outcomes as compared to kids who touch only one of those systems? Higher rates of recidivism. They're more likely to age out of the child welfare system without a permanent home or family connection. They're more likely to experience homelessness, unemployment, and jail stays, and all of this despite the fact that they're served by more people within our systems than anybody else. So what do we do about that? Well, are you and your communities aware of a recent report, the OJJDP Dual System Youth Design Study, that highlighted commonly adopted policies and practices around the population of dual status youth? They identified that jurisdictions taking on this work have engaged in early identification of dual system involvement. So think about your community at the moment. Do you have a mechanism for identifying when you have kids in common? Another common practice is improved information sharing between systems. Information sharing is oftentimes an obstacle for folks working across systems. I say the 5-letter words that everyone's afraid of, FERPA and HIPAA, that make us feel like we can't talk to one another. It takes some education, but there are ways to work together in a safe way that protects people's privacy but allows you to do your job with the best information you can get. And finally, another common practice is using coordinated case supervision across systems. And that these practices have resulted in positive outcomes. We have fewer petitions at follow-up in communities that have taken on these common practices. We have increased youth involvement in pro-social activities, Some jurisdictions have experienced reduction in behavior problems, academic problems, mental health and substance abuse, and ultimately fewer arrests. So jurisdictions that have engaged in this coordinated and collaborative work regarding dual status youth have also reported that among their most valued achievements has been improving the relationships between those working in partner systems. And I love this quote that came out of this study that indicated one individual highlighting the value of recognizing the tools that were already at each agency, that it was a matter of communicating and realizing what the other had to offer and build our work off of that. I don't know if that reminds you of anything from about 35 minutes ago, but that sounds like a yes and to me, which I really love. So in California, there's been particularly robust implementation of dual status youth practices. So some collaboration is required of all of you through WIC 241.1, right? There's a joint assessment, but practice can, and I argue should, go beyond that. Almost a decade ago, Santa Clara took on the challenge of better serving dual status youth. They created a shared articulation. I know you can't read this, but trust me. These are their documents creating a shared articulation of the challenges facing dual status youth and challenges within their systems in serving dual status youth. They also identified shared outcomes that they sought from their collaborative work. And they decided to do the hard work of actually practicing together, engaging in practice collaboratively. This required creating opportunities to work together as a dually involved youth unit. They supervise cases together. They take a team-oriented approach to working across systems. Now, other jurisdictions may not have actual dual jurisdiction protocols, but they still work on deepening their collaboration. I worked in El Dorado County for a while on working with them to create new communication pathways for identifying youth that they had in common. And this flow chart shows you the opportunities they identified for collaboration, even though they were not a dual jurisdiction county. But they found points at which a multidisciplinary team or a CFT can occur specific to dual status youth. Again, these are efforts that benefit from that foundation of collaboration. Now, building off the work around dual status youth have been collaborative processes to benefit children who are victims of commercial sexual exploitation, something that we've really become aware of in the last decade, and many counties struggle to respond to. Again, efforts must start with establishing that cross-system infrastructure. Everyone has a part to play: law enforcement, child welfare services, probation, judges, attorneys, behavioral health, service providers. This group must also have that shared understanding of the issue. What it is, we have a definition up there. The challenges in understanding prevalence and identifying kids who don't see themselves as victims very often, and trying to do so without necessarily having established processes for screening and identification. It's also challenging because traditionally these kids have come into our juvenile justice system, but we've come to understand that these kids are victims and that the majority have histories of trauma and have prior or current involvement with the child welfare system. Research tells us in different jurisdictions it's been anywhere between 50% and 90% of kids who are commercially sexually exploited who have had contact with the child welfare system. It's considered a risk factor. Is there this shared understanding in your community that, as Dr. Bruce Perry says, these kids who have been exploited have likely experienced lifelong trauma? They see violence as communication. They have a sense of deep worthlessness, a distrust of people in power and who want to help, and a belief that their body is an object to be hurt. So what does that tell us? It tells us that these youth are likely to be involved in situations involving violence. They will struggle against those who are trying to help. They will show up in our juvenile justice system, right? Even if it's not because they're being charged with solicitation. But they're engaging in activities that will bring them to your attention. They'll show up in our child welfare systems, in our behavioral health systems, in our hospitals, and on our streets. We need to have this shared understanding in order to develop an informed and coordinated response. And we now have practices recommended or required by the government, recommended by researchers and advocates that focus on creating a multidisciplinary system of care approach that relies on cross-system collaboration and incorporates youth voices. You may have seen the MOU template or utilized this put out by the CPOC action team that highlights some of these recommended practices, especially the establishment of trafficking-specific or adapted MDTs to address these complex cases. Now, furthermore, I've done some research on the development of specialty courts for commercially sexually exploited children. We've found that there's about 21 of these specialty courts across the country. 11 of them are here in California. You raise your hand if you're in a county that you know has a specialty court for commercially sexually exploited children. Okay, great. So we have many of the practitioners in here today. This is kind of the quintessential collaborative, coordinated approach to addressing a persistent issue. Despite the fact that there's been a decriminalization of child victims, most of these courts still operate out of the juvenile justice side of the juvenile court. But among the key characteristics of the court is a multidisciplinary and cross-system collaboration with a dedicated multidisciplinary team supporting stages of change. Initial evaluations have found that youth in these specialty courts experienced an increase in linkage to specialized services, improved residential placement stability, and a reduction in recidivism. Specialty court participation was also associated with improved educational outcomes and decreased instances of running away. And I really want to pause on that because I think that is one of those persistent issues that we know puts kids at risk for exploitation. So we do have some initial data that tells us that these courts have reduced some of those instances, which is a huge win. The findings support the conclusion that multidisciplinary collaboration can help target and respond to the multifaceted needs of adolescents. It can encourage healthy behaviors and promote their overall wellness. And finally, done some work on a collaborative framework to address the longstanding issue of racial and ethnic disparities in our youth justice and child welfare systems. This might be the most persistent and concerning issue faced by our systems, is this continued challenge, even after 25 years of progress in really bringing down the number of kids arrested and detained and incarcerated. No less than any other area of improvement, this must be addressed through development of a cross-system infrastructure. Again, we start with the shared understanding, right? Disproportionality within child welfare and youth justice systems is already significant, and alarmingly, studies show overrepresentation of Black youth in dual status youth populations can be more than double that in single system populations. My research on this has led to the development of a framework for change, surprise, surprise, based on collaboration. It requires a cross-system and system-wide commitment to three things: recognition, reorientation, and responsibility. Recognition focuses on the fact that everyone working in youth and family serving systems must have knowledge and understanding of the racial history of our systems. A race-conscious lens needs to be applied to our work with youth. We can no longer be distracted by the debate over whether disproportionate need or disproportionate offending is the cause of overrepresentation of Black youth in our systems, or whether bias and discrimination is alone to blame. At this point, we must simply concede the point that racial discrimination has produced both the societal conditions that give rise to disproportionate risks and needs, as well as systems that were rooted and remain subject to explicit and implicit biases. That needs to be the recognition at the foundation of change. Once recognized, systems must reorient themselves, reframing the value and assets of their communities, as well as the community's primacy of perspective and leadership in crafting solutions. There must be efforts to empower those with lived experience who are experts in their own lives, and to support solutions that invest in and originate with the communities themselves. Finally, systems must be held responsible for change. This requires, you guessed it, the collection of local and state data highlighting the disparate experiences of Black youth and families. And there must also be consistent reporting and review of data indicating whether reform efforts have been effective in reducing disparities. This framework offers areas of prioritization to begin to make progress on eliminating the disparities that plague our children of color. So, in conclusion, ultimately, we've seen that the complex circumstances that children, youth, and families find themselves in that lead them to involvement with probation and foster care require a collaborative and coordinated approach that centers the youth and family and challenges each of us to step beyond the limited role that we may have previously inhabited. After 25 years of progress, we need to take the same risks that I asked the kids themselves to take, to step out of their comfort zone, to trust those with whom we work. Yes, we can do this, and the kids are worth it. So thank you so much. Okay, I have a few minutes and a few questions. Okay, great. Oh, I did not bring my readers up here. Oh, gosh. I've reached that age, right? All right. In promoting a culture of collaboration, do we run the risk of re-stigmatizing any one group of youth or people? Re-stigmatizing. I don't know if this question, it might be getting at, a lot of the work that we've done, we need to be mindful of the fact that we don't net widen, or that we don't make assumptions about anybody, especially when we look at the research. We might want to, we want to know the information about a lot of the risks, the needs, the outcomes, but we don't ever want to make it determinative, looking at kids who are in the child welfare system and saying, oh, that's a risk factor for youth justice involvement, and therefore, we expect them to get in trouble. So there is a risk of stigmatizing. And I think that that's something that through your multi-system work and your infrastructure, you need to be really mindful of and discuss, because none of those outcomes are determinative, and we're not going to assume that anyone is going to, act in a certain way. We just want to be mindful of the risks, and again, focus on where the resources are to help prevent anything that we might see going forward, or be concerned about going forward. Okay. What are your thoughts on why dual jurisdiction youth have the poorest outcomes? Oh, good, okay. I think that we're doing better, but we still have a long, long way to go in recognizing that the behaviors that we see in a lot of kids in our systems are really responses to trauma. And so I think dual jurisdiction youth have had poor outcomes quite often because when they're part of our system, we tend to get them more and more ingrained in our system, more and more embedded in our systems. And as we know from the research, if kids are high need but they're low risk, it doesn't really benefit them to come deeper into our systems. And from the child welfare side, if they're coming deeper into our systems, we have the risk of re-traumatizing kids in removing them from their families, removing them from their siblings, removing them from the bonds that can be important and positive to them. If we're doing that based on not understanding necessarily the family's history of trauma either. So I really feel like a lot of our responses that complicates the cases with dual status youth and leads to some of the poorest outcomes really comes from a place of not understanding and recognizing that what we're seeing is a result of trauma and really focusing our response on healing that trauma rather than penalizing a family or a youth. Okay, do you think an increased role of behavioral health earlier will or would help address needs of youth and children and avoid their referrals to probation? Yes. I can say more, but I think yes. And, see previous answer. Right? I mean, so much is about recognizing that trauma, whether it's in a school where they could get appropriate counseling and a response to something that they did. I'm going to do the second shout out to Kiki from her presentation yesterday, just really laying out a scenario in which we see a kid who's responding in a way that, we criminalize when really it may have just something to do with either normal adolescence, right? Or dealing with, some challenges and traumas or difficulties within the family that could really be addressed through counseling and supports rather than criminalization. Okay, how important is sizeism in relationship to racial and ethnic disparities? I don't know. I don't know what sizeism is. Is there someone who asked this question that would like to clarify? Yeah.
I don't think that there's a recognition of, for instance, if there is a tall black guy,
Oh, yeah.
he is sometimes recognized as almost being an adult,
Yeah.
but he's not.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we do have quite a bit of research that identifies that there is a real adultification of young black males. And in fact, when it comes to black females, it's very similar as well. And they're not necessarily, it's kind of an over-sexualization of young black females and an adultification of males. So that's the kind of research that I just implore jurisdictions to sit down as a cross-system endeavor to begin to discuss. And I'm not going to lie, these are what we call courageous conversations to be had, right? Not everyone is open to hearing those perspectives or that information. But as a researcher, I really tend to bring the research to the table. So the opportunity to do that cross-system training so that everyone is getting the same information and starts from the same shared foundation, and you can disagree. But, we have to start with some facts that we're willing to put out there and build our efforts off of. So that's how I'd respond to that. And then I have 1 minute left and one question left. This is impressive for me, I have to say, to be on time. What do you think, or what did you find in the specialty court research that resulted in youth running away less? So a couple things. The specialty courts take an approach that really embraces the stages of change and recognizing that kids, especially who have been exploited, like the Dr. Bruce Perry quote that I put up there, they're going to be resistant quite often to viewing themselves as victims and accepting and trusting people who want to help them. So part of building that trust is letting kids know that you're not going to be criminalized, you're not going to be in trouble if you are going to make the choice to run. We're still here. We're still here. And you can come back to me, your social worker, or your probation officer, and we'll jump right back into where we were, right? So it's recognizing that it is going to take those steps to create that trust. And second, I think the other thing is a lot of the specialty courts have engaged with youth advocates and survivor advocates, which is pretty much considered a best practice now when it comes to working with commercially sexually exploited children. So there's somebody that they can connect to who understands what they're going through from a lived experience perspective. And that's a person that they will continue to connect with and that can really give them a credible message for why sticking with the program might actually benefit them. So those are a couple of things that we've seen that have been really productive. So thank you for the questions, and thank you so much for your attention, and have a great break.